this was this moment in history of the People's Republic when things are opening up. It's wild, lots of energy, lots of enthusiasm, all kinds of new young PhD students I was hanging out with.
So hi Hans, thank you for agreeing to have this interview with me. And at the beginning, let me ask you, how did you start? Where did you start from?
Where did I start from? I started from, in the Netherlands you have to decide on your university topic age 16, 17. And I was struggling with that because I just didn't know what to do, like most kids. And there were various options. The track I was on, I could even have done math, because I took math until 18. I could have done theology, I could have done Arabic, I could have done Russian, and I decided to do Chinese for absolutely no reason at all, other than that it was something new, sounded interesting, a few people were doing it, and there was a kind of, I think it's true for a lot of European sinologists, it's kind of, if you can demonstrate you're good at Chinese, boy, you're clever. So I wanted to demonstrate that. Have you read this book, Autodafé?
No.
Oh, it's from, it won the Nobel Prize before the Second World War by, you may want to Google who wrote that. It's a great author. But it's the sinologist just before the Nazis come, was this great thing, and it all goes up in flames, and he is the great mind of Europe. So I that probably was a rather obnoxious motivation as well. But so no good reason. Then I started doing it at Leiden, which was the only place you could do it in the Netherlands. The first half year were a disaster, but somehow something clicked and it worked out. It was good, and then after 3 years I went to the United States and to Philadelphia first of all, where I met weekly with Suna Khan, which was absolutely wonderful, transformative for me. And she packed me off to Harvard, where I did my PhD. And one reason I wanted to go to the United States is because in the Netherlands, it really was sinology of the old style. So, by the second week, you're introduced to the social, and by year 2, it's the Guan Guanzhi, and any idea that there might be something interesting that happened in China after 1900 was clearly an unacceptable proposition. For that, you had to go to the United States, and so I did. And,
because you were interested in what happened in a more recent period.
I was rather more interested in that, yeah. At the same time, I thought the education in Leiden I've always treasured. Working with people like Wild Inema, of course, a great translator, great scholar. There's one of the best libraries of Chinese literature. I visited him recently, absolutely fantastic. And an absolutely superb teacher. Eric Zöger was still there. In my second year, he had me off researching the Gaozong Zhuan, which I fine, but what is all, this is this really weird world we're suddenly being introduced to. And I really was more of a modern historian, and that worked out very well. And then, so people often, like you, I'm sure, they ask you, why did you do this? And I think it's the wrong question. Rather, the explanation is, you begin it in an unconsidered way, and then things work out and they pile on and it becomes interesting, and then you go to Harvard, and then you go to China, you meet a lot of people there, you go to Taiwan, rather the other way around, and then you get a nice job here, and so it's always been fun and interesting, and I've never really wanted to do anything else, absolutely.
But you did make some decisions, for example, this transition to modern history. And what about history? Why history?
That was really not, you're right, of course, there are some decisions in that. So when I went to the United States, I had 2 options. One was to go to China for a year of studying in China, but it was very early on that Europeans could go to China. There had been a year before me, and sort of my friends who came back, there were 2 or 3.
Which year was approximately?
77, 78.
Okay.
They came back as basket cases because it was so tough, right? They were at Peking University. They had to live in this dormitory, which of course is still there. and found it horrible. It was cold. It was hot water 1 hour a week. They're not allowed out other than to do their morning exercises. And it was just awful. So my option was to do that or to go to the United States and discover this whole new world. And I thought, well, China's going to stay around. I'm not going to get that opportunity again, so I'll go to the United States. And that worked out absolutely fine, of course. So I was glad with that decision. History was, because the program at Harvard was history and East Asian languages. It's one of those things in between the history department and the Department of East Asian Languages, which combined both. And well, that sounds good. So then I did that, and then you have to decide on that's actually the big decision. Then you have to decide on the dissertation topic. And I sort of fished around with various things. Then I decided on the Chinese Communist Party. And again, I'm just lucky that way. When I go to China, I find really good, interesting sources for what I'm doing. And there's plenty out there. You just have to go out and hunt them. But so I went to China, as in the mainland China, the first time, the People's Republic, 86, 87. This was this moment in the history of the People's Republic when things are opening up. It's wild, lots of energy, lots of enthusiasm, all kinds of new young PhD students I was hanging out with. Great time, and they said, oh, you want to do this? Well, here is this great source. And they were just feeding me books from their libraries that were not otherwise available, officially sort of Nepal. And it was just the Wild West, really. So they gave me, they would, after closing out of the library, they would give me a stack of books for me to photocopy, and I would get on my bike and race down to, because you couldn't photocopy it on the street because in Nepal. I went to some newspaper office, Washington Post. Yeah, it was the Washington Post. And then through the night, we were just copying. And in the early morning, I gave those books back. And by the end of the summer, I had these 2 huge cases of just wonderful archival sources that nobody had seen. And from that, I could write my PhD dissertation in a year. And it just took off. And that collection actually was a major part of the Fairbanks Center collection. That is I think outside China is the best. And the Chinese Communist Party. And that worked because we made an arrangement I was not the only one who could do this, of course, that we would, all of us who would go to China and find stuff like that, we could hold on to it ourselves for 3 months or 6 months, and then we would give it to Nancy Hurst, who would put it in her library. And the actuals are very sound. So we could write our dissertations, and then we were a little bit ahead of the game. And then make sure that everybody else could read it as well. And that was great. And I had this wonderful, you're just discovering new things all the time doing that. I had this wonderful moment when I was sitting in the Fairbanks Center Libraries in the basement, and Stuart Schramm, who was the great biographer of Mao Zedong, the really great guy, and Mao Zedong studies Mao, the thought of Mao, etc., etc. And we were talking. He was a very forbidding figure. He could be very rough. That he said, something about, the power comes out of the barrel of the gun. That famous phrase that was first said in 1934. I said, no, that was in August 1927. What do you know? And I said, well, no. Here is this collection. It's right there. This is of the 7th Congress, the Emergency Congress. It's right there. Here in a minute. He's saying it right. Oh, okay. And these little victories, just give you, these are silly, but they give you confidence, enthusiasm, and there's something to do here. And so that sort of began my first phase of writing about the Chinese Communist Party. And that was just good fun. It became my first book, obviously.
Okay. And so eventually you got your PhD at Harvard?
Yeah.
And then what happened after that?
So after that, I went to Berkeley, a postdoc at Berkeley, which was a bit of a disappointment because Berkeley is a center for modern Chinese studies. But Fred Wakeman, who was the big guy, he was then in New York heading the Social Science Research Council. So he wasn't there. Very few other people were there. So it was not very interesting at that point. But I was rewriting my dissertation for publication. And then midway through, actually very early on, by October, so I got there in August, and by October I came for an interview here, I got offered a job, and so we were spiritually moving already away from Berkeley. So I didn't make very good use of the Berkeley.
So this was basically your first job?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Luckily, I know. Just one funny moment when I was 27, 28, and I came here and I went to see Glenn Dudbridge, who was the professor of Chinese at his college, and I sort of arrived, jet lag, picked up the phone, so to make contact and arrange a time to meet. And so I dialed the phone. This was the Porter's Lodge, and I said in my best American English, "Hi, is this Magdalene College?" No, and the phone went down. Or I said, and the phone went down. I was all nervous, first job. I really badly needed a job. I had no money. I had like 200 quid in the bank or something. Plus, by that time, a wife to support. So I dialed again. Is this Magdalene College? Oh, the phone went down again. And that happened 3 or 4 times. And finally caught on that Magdalene College really should be pronounced as Magdalene. And from then on, it went okay. But that was my introduction to the idiosyncrasies of Cambridge, which it takes a lifetime to get used to, as you know. Yeah.
Okay, and so what was like Cambridge in the beginning? Who was here? What was happening here?
Who was here was Glenn, of course. Who was, I have great respect for Glenn, absolutely fantastic, great scholar. But I think he was unhappy here. He wanted to go back to Oxford. He had David McMullen, who then succeeded Glenn. Again, David is an absolutely wonderful scholar, great with students. For modern Chinese, there was a guy named Robert Schloss, who I think had worked in intelligence in Hong Kong, and had worked with Dennis Twitchett, who by that time had gone on to Princeton, but he still lived here. So he would occasionally teach at Princeton, but actually live here. And Bob Sloss, I liked him a lot, and the students really, really liked him. He was very dedicated, but I think he was disappointed in life in many ways, which was very sad to see. But he was a really dedicated teacher. But he was trying to introduce modern ways of teaching modern Chinese, which ran into problems. And Michael Levy, of course. Michael was Michael.
He was a historian too.
He was an historian too. And I loved Michael. Again, he was fantastic with students, very supportive. And one of his early books had a great impact on me. So at Leiden, we were in our first year of history. We were, requested to select 10 books and essentially memorize them as our introduction to Chinese history, which I think is a good way of doing it, though you can't do it now. And I took one of his daily life in Han China.
Yes.
I thought it was fantastic, and I learned a lot from them. And so one time I introduced Michael at a seminar, and I recounted that story, and I think he was very pleased with that memory. But there were, I think the students there were very few students, of course. There were very few, if any, graduate students. One of my sort of shocks to the system was of Glenn dismissing or failing half the students. It was like, oh shit, what are you doing? And they just had to go, right? They failed the exam, so they had to go. So that was kind of wrong. And it was very demanding that way. It didn't really build up. It took a while. And I think one of my first, so at Cambridge, part of university, but then I also was part of this college, the Catharine College. These colleges were good because people like Chris Bailey were here, all the good historians. That was really very supportive, interesting group of historians was here. That was very helpful.
In college? Or?
Yeah. It's Chris Clark, Chris Bailey, John Thompson, myself, a few others at that time. And we just sort of hang out and chatted a lot. And that really shaped me, I think, in several ways. But again, the college was alienating and extreme. As you can imagine, I'm this Americanized European 28, 29-year-old, and you come here and everybody is suited up, gowned up, very officious at meetings. And one of my first meetings was a 3-hour discussion about how the lawn ought to be cut. And this story is a real Cambridge story, because this debate was whether it should be cut traditionally, meaning that the grass doesn't grow over the bricks surrounding the court. Mm-hmm. And the modern way was let it grow over, and then the mowing is easier. It's just drive down this took 3 hours. The decision was again very Cambridge. It was a compromise. So one half was cut.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah.
that's quite a compromise.
It's quite, yeah. I think it's still cut that way. And then 20 years later, I was at some reception in the college where this anecdote was debated, and the then master it was his view that what was happening was that the Cat's fellows, he was just new at that point, were testing him, see if he could put up with this kind of behavior, which he did. And then the real story came out. There was a personal vendetta between the garden committee. And if you know St. Cat's, there was really no point in having a garden committee, given that there is no garden, plus somebody else and so this was really a personal fight between these two people, played out over a huge governing body meeting about grass. And I went home and I was like, what have I done? Where is this coming to? So it just took a while. I mean, you must have had the same. It took a while to get used to it. For me, the lesson eventually was these guys really care about their buildings, and that actually shows. So I think there's some,
and their garden,
and especially
and the non-existing garden.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but I think it was still early on, right? I could come here because I didn't need a work permit because of the European Union. That has just happened. I was the first European.
So when was this? What year did you come?
This was 88.
Okay. Yeah.
So, it was still the EC, European Community. Britain was part of it, but a decade by then. Again, I think within Cambridge, within the college, I was the first European, I'm sure. Within Cambridge, there were not that many either. And so one of the things that's happened over the last 30 years is the internationalization of the academic staff at Cambridge. So that's one of the very, very big changes.
And is that a good change, or?
I think it's a great change.
Yeah.
It has made Cambridge far more cosmopolitan than it used to be. And it was still, the reference framework was still very British, maybe British Empire, but still that. Of course, now I think it is genuinely more cosmopolitan, even though, of course, Brexit means that we are changing this again. We had students the last couple of decades who used Erasmus, who used the various regulations that European students would pay the same fees as home students. All that is gone. So students like Rassam Moazin, who came from Germany, got a fellowship, got a grant, is paid a few fees, and then was taken on, and is now that kind of trajectory is no longer possible. And I think that's a great disaster, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
And going back to you starting here, I wanted to ask, how formative were your first years as a teacher? In terms of your research and intellectual curiosity or something. So were you formed after the PhD, or?
That's a great question. It really is. I think that's true. I mean, I began. We were trained as researchers, really. And for me to start teaching was I'm a little afraid of that. It's a fearsome proposition to stand up in front of them, but I liked it, actually, and I think teaching is the most important thing we do, and I think we're very privileged that we have that contact with the younger generation. I enjoy it just about every time, not all the time, but just about every time. But I think it did shape me, and I think coming here was good in the sense that in our program, as you know, we teach Chinese history by the use of Chinese texts. And that, I think, is very different from the United States, where people who teach modern history will end up not using their language very much, and therefore their language skills decline very rapidly. So that, I think, is a very good part of this program, and I find it always very helpful and very useful.
But that's really a traditional program, so more for like pre-modern.
No, modern
no?
too. Yeah. So in our third and fourth year in our set text courses, we used them. In that time, we still use a lot more set text, and I was teaching a lot more of this. But even in special subjects, we're required to use set text. So that's great. Less than the pre-modern, but it's still there. So that was one thing that I've always appreciated. The other thing that helped me in my career is that in the United States, military history was a no-no. I had questions from colleagues, like, "Oh, it's interesting military history, but we thought you were a good guy. What happened to you?" But in Cambridge, there was until then a really strong tradition of military history, people like Geoffrey Parker and so on. There's still some of it in the history faculty. And so I took that up, and after finishing my first book in Chinese Communist Party, why do we talk about this party without actually talking about the enormous violence in which it has been engaged? So there's that. So I turned to that as a subject. The other thing is more of a personal decision, but many people, even here, certainly in Europe, saw the United States as the center for the study of China and would go there. And I decided, no, what we really need to do is develop our links with China and go there and build connections and build networks.